There is a photograph taken in 1956 that almost nobody talks about. Not the arrest photograph, the one you know, the staged recreation where she sits behind a white man on a Montgomery bus, her face turned toward the window with an expression so composed, it looks almost like boredom. Almost like she is simply watching the street go by and thinking about what to make for dinner. That photograph was taken weeks after the actual arrest, organized by a journalist, deliberately constructed for maximum impact. It is an icon. It is also, in a technical sense, a fiction. The photograph I am talking about is different. It was taken by a wire service photographer during the boycott itself, on a Montgomery sidewalk, and in it, Rosa Parks is walking. Just walking. One foot lifted, her coat buttoned against the Alabama winter, her handbag in the crook of her elbow. But it is her face that stops you. She is not looking at the camera. She is not performing anything for anyone. She is simply moving forward, and her expression is one of the most unsettling things I have ever seen in a documentary photograph. Not because it shows anger, not because it shows suffering, but because it shows certainty. An absolute bedrock geological certainty. The face of a woman who has already decided something that cannot be undecided. The face of a woman who is not fighting for her rights so much as reclaiming something she always knew was hers. The question that photograph has always forced, for anyone who looks at it long enough, is simple and unanswerable by any biography or history book. Where does that come from? Not the politics. Not the NAACP membership or the Highlander folk school training or the decades of organizing work, all of which are real, all of which matter enormously. But that quality, that specific density of conviction in a human face, that thing that looks less like courage, which implies the possibility of fear, and more like recognition, as if she is simply acknowledging something ancient that has been living in her chest her entire life, waiting for December 1st to finally have a use for it. Biographers have pointed to her grandfather. They are right to do so. Sylvester Edwards is one of the most important and least examined figures in the entire Rosa Parks story. Here was a man of visible mixed ancestry, the product of an assault on his enslaved mother by a white landowner, a fact the family knew and did not conceal, who sharecropped a small farm in Pine Level, Alabama, in the early years of the 20th century, and who responded to the Ku Klux Klan's night rides, not by boarding up the windows and praying, but by pulling out a shotgun and sitting in the front room where he could see the road. He told his granddaughter, without melodrama, that he intended to take some of them with him if it came to that. And she believed him, and she sat with him. A child in the darkness with her grandfather and a loaded gun watching for torchlight. That is where the biographers stop. They mark Sylvester Edwards as the source of her steel and they move on. But Sylvester Edwards had a mother, and she had a mother, and she had a mother before her. And not one of those women appears in any document by name until 1870, when the federal government of the United States, for the first time in its history, condescended to record the names of people it had previously catalogued as livestock. Before 1870, the paper simply closes, and what the DNA found on the other side of that closed paper is what this film is about. Here is something that the standard Rosa Parks story requires you to overlook in order to function as a clean narrative. The name Parks is not old. It is not deep. It is a marriage name from 1932, from a barber in Wedowee who himself carried a bloodline of staggering complexity. But that is a different investigation. The name Macaulay, her birth name, is also not old in the way that matters. It is a name that was assigned or adopted sometime after emancipation, in that brutal window of the late 1860s when 4 million people were released from bondage into a country that had no infrastructure for their freedom and no language adequate to their situation, and were required, in the strange bureaucratic grammar of Reconstruction, to suddenly have surnames. Some took the names of former enslavers. Some invented names entirely. Some chose names that carried meaning: Freeman, Justice, Liberty, names that functioned less as family identifiers than as declarations of intent. The selection of a surname in 1866 or 1867 by a formerly enslaved person in central Alabama was not a casual administrative act. It was, in many cases, the first autonomous act of self-definition a human being had been permitted to perform in their entire life. It was the first time the law acknowledged that they were the kind of entity that could have a name. The Macaulays chose Macaulay. Why that name and not another is not recorded anywhere. The sound of it, Irish, probably Scots-Irish in origin, the kind of name that would have been common in the white landowning families of antebellum Montgomery County, suggests a connection to an enslaver's household, though it does not confirm one. In the South of that period, the adoption of a former enslaver's name was sometimes a strategic decision, and sometimes simply the only name a family had ever heard applied to themselves. You were John's Rosa, John's James, John's children, and when John's world collapsed in 1865, and you were suddenly required to be something other than John's property, the name John was, paradoxically, the only anchor available. The silence before the name is absolute. Go to the 1860 slave schedule for Montgomery County. Run your finger down the columns. The enumerator's handwriting is surprisingly neat for a document of such violence. A careful cursive that records age, sex, color, and a numerical placeholder for the physical description of each enslaved person. There are no names. This was not an oversight. The decision not to record names was a deliberate legal and philosophical position. These were not people. These were units of agricultural capital. The Constitution of the United States, in its original architecture, had already encoded this position mathematically. 3/5 of a person. The infamous compromise that gave slaveholding states extra congressional representation for the bodies they owned, without giving those bodies any of the rights that representation was supposed to protect. So you look at the columns. Female, age 28, black. Female, age 9, mulatto. Male, age 6, black. Female, age 3, black. And somewhere in those columns, in one of those entries in Montgomery County, Alabama, in the year 1860, is a woman who is Rosa Parks's direct maternal ancestor. She has an age and a color notation, and she has nothing else. The federal government has taken her name and given her a tick mark in exchange. She will not get her name back for 5 more years. And when she does, the name she gets will be a borrowed one. But here's the thing about DNA. DNA does not borrow names. DNA does not take names away. DNA does not recognize the legal philosophy of the antebellum South or the administrative convenience of the slave schedules. DNA is indifferent to the entire apparatus of American racial terror. It simply records what happened at the level of the molecule across thousands of years of human movement and human life, and it records it with a fidelity and a specificity that no courthouse fire, no plantation ledger, no census enumerator's deliberate indifference can touch. The silence in the paper record is not silence in the genetic record. And the genetic record, when it was finally read, told a story that begins not in Alabama, not in 1860, not in any archive that any researcher has ever walked into. It begins somewhere else entirely. somewhere older. Somewhere that, once you understand it, makes that expression on Rosa Parks's face in that 1956 sidewalk photograph feel less like a mystery and more like a message from very far away. To understand what the DNA found, you have to first understand what the DNA was looking for. And to understand that, you have to sit with the geography of the transatlantic slave trade for a moment. Not as an abstraction, not as a chapter in a textbook, but as a physical reality with specific ports, specific ships, specific routes that deposited specific African populations into specific regions of the American South. Alabama, Central Alabama, Montgomery County specifically, was not a first-generation slave territory. By the time Alabama became a state in 1819, the domestic slave trade had already developed its own internal geography, moving enslaved people from the exhausted tobacco fields of Virginia and the Carolinas westward into the cotton frontier of the Deep South. The enslaved population of central Alabama in the antebellum period was therefore a mixed genetic stream. Some people whose ancestors had arrived directly from West Africa in the 18th century, others who had been moved through multiple states across multiple generations, their African origins diluted by time and distance from the original point of crossing. This matters for what the DNA reveals. Because in a population with that kind of layered movement history, a strong, specific genetic signal pointing back to a particular region of Africa, a signal strong enough to survive 2 centuries of movement and admixture, is not an accident. It is a testament to the intensity of the original contribution. It means that somewhere in Rosa Parks's maternal lineage, the African connection was concentrated, preserved, passed down with unusual fidelity through the maternal line. And the signal that emerges from that maternal line is one of the most historically resonant things you can find in the genetics of the African diaspora. The mitochondrial haplogroup, the deep maternal signature. The thing passed from mother to daughter's daughter across every generation, unchanged, since before the first human being ever walked out of the African continent and into the wider world. Rosa Parks's maternal haplogroup traces back to a specific population cluster in a specific part of West Africa, and the reference populations that match it most powerfully are not a broad, generic West African category. They are rooted with a precision that makes the genealogical researchers who study this data pause and look twice in the region of the Niger Delta. In the cultural world of the people who, for 1,000 years before the slave trade, built the most spiritually complex and politically sophisticated civilizations on the African continent. But before I tell you their name, I want you to understand something about the world they built. Because the world they built was not simply old. It was not simply impressive by the condescending standard of impressive for Africa. It was not a footnote to anyone else's story. It was, on its own terms, in its own context, by any honest measurement of human achievement and human ingenuity, one of the extraordinary things that our species has ever produced. And when you understand what was taken, when you understand the specific civilization that was fractured and scattered and loaded onto ships, then Rosa Parks's entire life starts to look different. Not just her refusal on that bus, her whole life, the quality of her, the texture of her resistance, the particular shape of the certainty in her face. It starts to look like continuity. It starts to look like memory. The people were called Igbo, not Yoruba, which is the answer most researchers expect when they pull West African DNA from central Alabama's enslaved population. Not Akan, not Wolof, not Mandinka, the great names that appear most frequently in the genetic literature on African American ancestry. The Igbo. A people so fiercely, almost pathologically committed to the concept of personal sovereignty that the slaveholders of the American South developed a specific, documented fear of purchasing them. There are plantation records, actual surviving plantation records from Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia, in which white landowners explicitly instruct their agents not to buy Igbo people at the coastal auctions. Not because they were physically inferior or economically undesirable, but because they would not break. Because the internal architecture of Igbo identity, the philosophical framework that every Igbo child absorbed before they could read or write or do anything except watch and listen to the adults around them, contained something that the slave system could brutalize but could not dismantle. The concept was called chi, your personal spirit, your individual divine mandate. The Igbo understood the universe as a place in which every human being arrived with a specific, inalienable spiritual identity that belonged to them alone, not to their family, not to their king, not to any earthly authority, however powerful. Your chi was yours. It was the part of you that existed before your birth and would persist after your death. And it was the part of you that no external force had any legitimate claim over whatsoever. The Igbo proverb says, "Onye kwe, chi ya ekwe." When a person agrees, their chi agrees, meaning the self is the final authority, meaning what you consent to defines what is real, meaning a thing done to you without your consent has not touched the deepest part of you. That part remains intact. That part cannot be reached. You begin to see why the slaveholders were afraid. A person who genuinely believes, at the level of spiritual bone, that their innermost self is unreachable by any earthly power. That person does not behave like someone who can be owned. They behave like someone who is temporarily, furiously, inconveniently contained. There is a difference. Slaveholders understood the difference viscerally even when they could not articulate it philosophically, which is why the documentation of their anxiety about Igbo enslaved people is so extensive and so specific. They wrote about it in letters. They discussed it in agricultural journals. The fear had a name on the Georgia coast, Igbo, the older spelling, and it was spoken with a particular careful quality that tells you everything about what these men understood themselves to be dealing with. The Igbo homeland sits in the southeastern part of present-day Nigeria, a landscape of dense tropical forest and river systems and the vast, fertile floodplain of the Niger Delta. This was not marginal land, not a peripheral geography. The Niger Delta was one of the most productive and commercially active regions of the entire African continent, a place where trade networks stretched north toward the Sahara and east toward the great kingdoms of the interior, where the Aro Confederacy controlled long-distance commerce across hundreds of miles, where the city-states of the Delta itself maintained sophisticated systems of merchant governance and long-distance credit that would not have been unfamiliar to a Venetian banker. The Igbo were farmers, yes, yam farmers specifically, and the cultivation of yam in Igbo culture carried the same cosmological weight that wheat carries in European tradition, the same sacred centrality that rice holds in parts of Asia. But they were also traders, metalworkers, textile weavers, philosophers, and masters of the oracle tradition that drew pilgrims from across the region to the shrine at Arachukwu, where the god Chukwu was said to speak directly to human beings who came with questions serious enough to deserve a divine answer. They had no kings. This is the detail that separates the Igbo from almost every other major civilization in West Africa, and it is the detail that, once you register it, makes everything else about their history, including their specific patterns of resistance under slavery, suddenly, completely legible. In a continent of elaborate royal courts and sacred monarchies and divine kingships, the Igbo organized themselves without centralized political authority. They governed through councils of elders, through age-grade associations, through the authority of titled men and women who earned status through achievement rather than inheriting it through bloodline. The idea that any single person could own another person, could claim absolute authority over another human being's body and labor and future, was not simply illegal in traditional Igbo society. It was philosophically incoherent. It violated the foundational logic of how the universe worked. Your chi was yours. Nobody could own your chi. Therefore, in the most fundamental sense, nobody could own you. When the slave trade arrived at the Niger Delta in the 16th and 17th centuries and accelerated catastrophically through the 18th, it did not find a passive population. The trade worked, in the Igbo case, largely through the mechanism of the Oro Confederacy, a network of long-distance traders who used the oracle at Arachukwu as both a commercial hub and a source of enslaved people, many of them individuals condemned by the oracle's judgment for various offenses, real or manufactured. The genius of this system, from the slaver's perspective, was that it outsourced the violence of capture to an indigenous institution with existing authority. From the perspective of the Igbo communities being raided and depleted, it was a civilizational catastrophe that tore apart the social fabric of hundreds of villages across the Delta region over the course of more than 2 centuries. The people who arrived on the other side of the Atlantic were therefore not, in any simple sense, defeated. They were stolen. There is a difference, and the Igbo maintained that difference with a ferocity that left a documented trail across the entire slave-holding American South. The trail ends where it began, on a bus, in December. In the particular amber light of a southern afternoon that was about to become the most consequential evening in American civil rights history. Rosa Parks did not know she was Igbo. She could not have known. The paper wall stood between her and that knowledge as solidly in 1955 as it had stood in 1870, as it had stood in 1860 when her ancestor was recorded as a tick mark beneath a white man's name in Montgomery County. She knew her grandfather Sylvester and his shotgun. She knew the red clay roads of Pine Level. She knew Raymond and the NAACP and the long, grinding, dangerous work of organizing in a state that would murder you for it. That was the knowledge available to her. That was the world the archive permitted. But the Chai does not require the archive. The Igbo understood this. The deepest part of you does not travel through documents. It does not require a census record or a haplogroup report or a genealogist with a subscription database. It moves through blood and through the quality of attention a grandfather pays to a dark road, and through the specific way a woman holds her shoulders when she has decided that today is the day the contained thing stops being contained. James Blake told her to move. The entire architecture of American apartheid stood behind that instruction. The law, the custom, the century of violence used to enforce both. Every system that had been built, specifically and deliberately, to make black people in Alabama feel that resistance was not merely futile, but unthinkable. And somewhere in the cellular memory of a woman whose great-great-grandmother had been recorded as property, whose ancestors had crossed the Atlantic in chains, whose people had once looked at the concept of human ownership and found it not merely unjust, but philosophically absurd. Somewhere in that deep, unarchived place, something very old and very certain simply said, "No, not in anger, not in desperation, in recognition. Her chi agreed, and she did not move,